It is 9 o'clock. Thank you very much for everybody being on time. As we decided yesterday, we will start with the last lecture of yesterday. And our chair will be Mr. Rajan, and he's going to be also Mr. David McDonald, but he's going to stop now, so we put Pedro instead. And the next two lectures are very tight, his chairs take over.
Actually, remotely back on time, Charlotte and I are going to merge our, kind of interfinger our talks, so she's actually going to start.
There's another mic there, the cordless mic. One thing you should use cordless mic.
Yeah, no, but this one here.
You can use the cordless if you're standing together.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the host for an excellent dinner last night. That was fantastic, and there is a link between that dinner and what I'm going to talk about. As David McDonald said, David McDonald is the chairman of the expert group on resource classification, and we decided that it would make more sense and more coherence for you if we combined our presentations. So I'm going to move the slide forward, which is
Bottom button.
Other bottom, okay. So we're going to split it up into a bit of an introduction about the Economic Commission for Europe and why the UN is involved in resource classification, then about what exactly is the UNFC and how it works, about the specifications, the bridging documents, and then a summary and some important observations. The reason why I wanted to speak first is I think that if you are considering the UNFC, and when we talk about the UNFC, that implicitly means the Crisco template as well, because the Crisco template is part of the UNFC. It provides the commodity-specific specifications for solid minerals. So I would never talk about the UNFC without also talking about the Crisco template. The two are part of one package. So it's not a question of either or. And I want to explain to you that the system that we've developed, the resource management tool that is the UNFC, has been developed over a very long period of time. It's been developed through an inclusive and transparent process. It's probably taken over 20 years. And so it's something it's solid and robust. And it's to try and explain to you that the work has been done, and if you are considering options, this is one activity that there's no need for you to duplicate the efforts that have already been done. So just a bit about the Economic Commission for Europe, which I'm sure many of you have never heard about, and then I'll explain why the UN is involved, the mandate that we have, the global mandate, and a bit importantly, about the history and development of the UNFC. So the UN splits the world into 5 regions. I work for the Economic Commission for Europe, that is one of the larger regional commissions. Then we have one looking after Asia Pacific, based in Bangkok, and we share the Central Asian member states. And then there's another one called ESWA that's based in Beirut and looks after Western Asia. There's the Economic Commission for Africa, based in Addis, and then ECLAC that looks after Latin America and the Caribbean, based in Santiago. So that's how the UN says it covers the world through these 5 regional commissions. The UNECE, where I work, we have 56 member states. We cover all of Eastern, Western, Central Europe, the CIS, Central Asia, and North America and Canada. I think USA and Canada. I think the USA and Canadian colleagues are always interested to see that they're part of Europe in terms of the UN. Just the ECE, why is the ECE involved in resource classification? The ECE, its bread and butter is development of norms and standards and best practice guidance, conventions. We make an impact on your daily lives. So for example, I said I'd make the link with dinner last night. How many of you actually ate curry last night? Okay, well, if you've been eating spicy food since you've been here, UNECE actually develops the global standards for chili peppers. And if any of you use a seatbelt, or you stop at a stop sign, or you've got children that use child safety seats, you eat meat, you drive a car in Europe, you breathe fresh air in Europe or the rest of the world. You use trade facilitation. What else? Forest management. Those are all guidelines, standards, norms, conventions that are developed within the Economic Commission for Europe. We have an impact on your daily lives. Last week I was actually at a meeting with the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon. There were actually 100 other people in the room, but I was there, and he actually described the Economic Commission for Europe as an undiscovered pearl, the undiscovered pearl of the UN system, because we do so much work behind the scenes that make a daily, an impact on your daily lives. And the work on energy that we do on resource classification is one of the flagship activities. We've been working on that for over 20 years. We have a lot of other activities, so we work on energy efficiency in buildings. We have renewable energy work. We're looking at best practice guidance, for example, in gas leakages. So we do a lot of work that really has an impact. And I think what we say is that we convert sustainable development into global public goods. So why is the UN involved in resource classification? There are probably 1 in 5 people in the world that currently don't have access to electricity, and more than double that still rely on coal and biomass for heating and cooking. You can't have sustainable development without sustainable energy. And 2014 is the start of the decade of sustainable energy for all. There are 3 global objectives: universal access to energy, doubling the share of renewables in the global energy mix, and doubling the rate of improvements of energy efficiency. Our work on resource classification, on resource management, delivers on all those 3 goals. And so that's why we're involved in resource classification. You can't manage, you can't improve what you can't measure. We provide a forum for governments to develop practical instruments, those conventions, norms and standards that I mentioned. Importantly, we provide a neutral platform for all stakeholders. We offer a platform that allows others to develop global solutions through an open and transparent process. And I think the convening power of the United Nations is unrivaled. There's no other forum that exists, and the UN was able to offer that forum for all the different stakeholders involved in resource classification and resource management. So we brought together governments, we brought together the financial community, the private sector, international organisations. They all came together in a neutral setting at the UN to develop the UNFC. Importantly, the UN framework classification is a voluntary system. It's not mandated by the UN. It's up to countries or companies if they want to mandate it, but the UN is not there as an enforcer, and that's been a very important part of the process. There are some companies that use the UNFC. They find it a very valuable resource management tool for internal purposes. There are some governments and countries around the world that have legislated the UNFC, and that would be the UNFC of 1997, because the 2009 version has only just become operational. There are many countries around the world that are considering adopting it as part of their national legislation. Importantly, the UNFC, it's a global project. Even though it's managed out of the Economic Commission for Europe, I want you to really understand that it is global in nature, and that's because of the ECOSOC decision. ECOSOC is the UN Economic and Social Council, and they adopted this decision back in 2004, and the important words there are that they invited the member states of the UN, international organisations and those 5 UN regional commissions to consider taking appropriate measures for ensuring worldwide application of the framework classification. And so that's very much the work that the expert group on resource classification has been undertaking, is to deliver on that ECOSOC decision. So just a bit about the expert group on resource classification, where it actually fits in this big UN system. As I mentioned, the Economic and Social Council, well, that operates at the same level as the General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, the Security Council, that I'm sure you've all heard of. Under the Economic and Social Council, we have those 5 UN regional commissions. They're intergovernmental in nature. And then we have a committee on sustainable energy, which is intergovernmental. It's a decision-making body where governments are represented. And then the expert group is an advisory body to that committee. The expert group works on consensus. Should there be a need, we would go to the Committee on Sustainable Energy if a decision needs to be taken. But within the expert group, thanks to Dave's excellent chairmanship, we've been able to reach consensus on all but one occasion. So, just a bit about the governance of the UNFC. It is governed and developed by the expert group, in which all stakeholders are represented. It's inclusive. All of you are welcome to join, and we would be very happy for you to do so. So we cover solid minerals, petroleum, uranium, and now because of the importance of sustainable development, the application to renewable energy is now a priority for member states. And the interest in extending the UNFC to cover both non-renewable and renewable energy projects has gathered a great deal of interest. So we're currently working on the documentation that would be needed to apply the UNFC also to renewable energy resources. And that's going to make the UNFC a much more powerful tool and of more interest to governments for their national resource management. So to be able to have a tool that allows you to understand your total non-renewable and renewable resource base is extremely powerful. As I mentioned, we cooperate extremely closely with CRISCO. They're on the Bureau, they have a seat on the Bureau, and also the similar body to CRISCO for petroleum is the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and they have similarly developed the commodity-specific specifications for application of the UNFC to petroleum. And so there is alignment between the petroleum system and the solid mineral system within the UNFC, as Dave McDonald will explain later. We also collaborate extremely closely with the International Atomic Energy Agency on uranium. We've just finalised the documentation, the bridging document between the UNFC and the IAEA Nuclear Energy Agency uranium classification that some of you may know as the Red Book. So the system is now aligned with the uranium classification system. And as I mentioned, very importantly, the group works on consensus. And I know consensus was an issue that was raised yesterday, but that's a very important aspect of the work of the group. And I think that's probably why, because we do work on consensus, it's taken a long time to reach the point that we're at now, but it's made the system more robust, more inclusive, and more stakeholders have bought into the system, have been part of the development process. The expert group has a 5-year mandate, and that's really unusual within the Economic Commission for Europe. It's the only, I think it's the only expert group at the UNECE that has such a mandate, and that's a recognition of the long-term nature of the classification work, and also of the work that's been done up to date, that the member states really see value in it. And we have annual meetings in Geneva, and again, all of you are welcome to attend. So I mentioned the stakeholders. These are the stakeholders. So we have governments to help them manage their resources, for industry to provide the data and information necessary to deploy the technology, management, finance, in order to serve the host countries, the stakeholders, and shareholders, and that's very important. And we have industry very well represented in the expert group, and they've been critically involved in the development of the UNFC. Also, we work with those organisations such as the International Energy Agency that develop those all-important mineral and energy studies. You know, if you can't rely on the data, you need consistent and reliable data to develop those energy scenarios. They need to be consistent and far-sighted. We also work very closely with the financial community, and that's to help. The UNFC helps them to provide the information necessary that they need to allocate capital appropriately, importantly reducing costs. So those are all the stakeholders that we work with. So what is the UNFC? So it's the UN Framework Classification for Fossil Energy and Mineral Reserves and Resources, and that's actually the only time that you will see reserves mentioned. It is in the title of the document. It's a global, generic, principle-based system. It's based on 3 fundamental criteria. we talk about three axes, but the focus should be that there are the three criteria that have been mentioned a number of times. It's because of the way it's been designed, it has a powerful numerical codification system, so it really enhances global communications because it avoids all the language barriers, and it's applicable to both solid minerals and fluids. As I mentioned, it's fully aligned with the Crisco template and the Petroleum Resource Management System, and other classification systems can be aligned with the UNFC. So, for example, the uranium system, we're now working with the Russian Federation to develop a bridging document between the new Russian Federation petroleum system. We're developing the documentation for renewables, and we're also looking at application to injection projects, so principally storage of carbon dioxide. So here we can see the numerical coding that Dave will explain to you in more detail shortly. But I think the fundamental principle of the UNFC is that projects or resources are classified as a series of projects with differentiation on each of the three axes. So you've got the social economic axis, the project feasibility, and the geological knowledge. And those, we need to think of those as three criteria, not as three axes. But those three criteria are the most real, and they're found in most other classification systems, either as implicit attributes or as direct criteria. But because the UNFC is direct on all three, it provides a framework through which other classification systems can be compared and harmonized, and it makes the UNFC an extremely powerful tool. So why is the UNFC needed? I mean, there is this need for a common global language for energy and mineral resources. I think if I was to ask each of you in the room what you understand by the word reserves, I think we'd have a variety of different answers. I think what a reserve in the petroleum sector, for example, is you've got your wellhead quantities, and then it goes through processing, separation into oil and gas, and your reserves are your saleable quantities. That's not the same for the mineral sector. And even within the mineral sector, for example, coal reserves are different. You talk about reserves which are pre-beneficiation, and then you've got your marketable reserves, which are your sales quantities. And then in the public domain, you see people talking about recoverable reserves or in-place reserves. There is just a huge misunderstanding over this word, and that's why we only use the word reserves in the title of the UNFC. There's also an increasing overlap between the mining and oil and gas industries. So the Crisco template was designed for solids. The petroleum resource management has been designed for fluids. But with the advent of unconventionals, there's an increasing overlap, and you see, for example, an increasing overlap as to, you see, for example, for the mining of bitumen, the mining of bitumen, we're having a fluid system applied to that. And there's also an increasing need to be able to compare renewable energy resources with non-renewable energy resources. Just a bit about the history. The UN has developed the system because there was a demonstrated need. It's not something that the UN imposed. Countries came to the UN and said, we want to develop a system that can help understand or develop a common system for solid minerals and mineral commodities. So that started in 1992. Then in 1997, after 5 years of work, the UNFC for solid fuels and mineral commodities was issued. And a number of countries around the world, including India, applied the UNFC of 1997. And then once that system was in place, member states came to the UN and said, well, actually, we'd like to see if we can extend that system to encompass petroleum and uranium. So the work started, and then in 2004, we developed what was essentially a draft system of the UNFC that applied to solid fuels, oil, gas, and uranium. And then in 2005, 2006, we started cooperating with the International Accounting Standards Board, and that's mentioned in the background document here. The IASB was looking to develop an international financial reporting standard for all extractive activities. One currently doesn't exist. So they had a look, and then under the auspices of the UN, CRISCO and PRMS worked together to align their systems. And as a result of that cooperation, we found that in order to achieve the alignment that we now have between the systems, that the UNFC of 2004 needed to be slightly modified. So in 2007, there were proposed simplifications to the definitions and some other fundamental changes to ensure that there could be the harmonisation that was needed. So in 2009, the UNFC was approved, and it was published in 2010, and then we started work on the rules of application, because the UNFC, that's the high-level definitions, and then you have to have the rules to ensure consistent application. So we worked for 2 to 3 years on the specifications. We went through a very inclusive, transparent, and process, for a robust process. We did a number of surveys, we went to public comment, and those specifications were then approved in April, and then they went for approval to the Economic Commission for Europe, and they were approved at the end of 2013, so the end of last year. The UNFC became operational, and that was a significant achievement in terms, or for resource management around the world. I think that's now Dave. Sorry, I was expecting another slide, but not that. Okay. Anyway, I'm pleased to hand over to Dave now for the anecdotes. Thanks very much.
Okay. I just actually thought I'd start off with a little bit of a quiz for all of you. Okay. Just to make sure that you're awake this morning. Now it's my turn to try and figure out how to work this. Here we go. Okay. To see if you can identify these companies. Okay. Famous company misrepresenting its reserves in collusion with its board of directors. Application of revised rules significantly altering management's previous estimates of reserves. Risk mitigation not in place, resulting in revision of field reserves. And management found to be trading shares prior to release revised reserve figures. These were four. I'm sure you all think you can spot which these different companies are. Maybe not all of them, but you all have an idea of a few of them there. These are four situations that were discussed in a presidential address at the London Institute of Mining, Metallurgy, Materials, Metallurgy and Mining, a presidential address. But the interesting thing about this is that this address was given in 1911. So, actually, the reason I put this up is to show that issues around reserves, and actually this is very similar to the presentation Caitlin gave, don't change. We have the same issues today that we're debating around reserves, and they're going to go on for a long time around these issues. And the reason is that there are different stakeholder groups that are interested in things. People want to have reserves represented in different ways, and frankly, people use reserves as a commercial, legal framework in presenting their volumes. We need to keep this in mind. The other reason I like to put this slide up when I give talks like this is to make it clear to you, don't think you're going to completely resolve the situation here today or even next year. This is something that is going to be an issue for the ISA for many, many years, and it's going to continue to develop with time. It's something that what we need to do is work together to strive to get to a better place. And hopefully the discussion today Charlotte and I are giving, and actually this whole week actually, is to put us in a framework, in a place where we can reach that place. So the UNFC, was this the slide you thought you were going to get? Okay, this is slide 19. Okay, so the UNFC, as Charlotte said, is a framework classification around that allows us to capture and measure and quantify our reserves and resources. It's a framework classification, and it's based on a set of definitions for the different categories. Sitting underneath that, we have a list of specifications which give more detailed application guidance around these definitions. And then coming up underneath those are a series of bridging documents to actual guidelines and existing specifications for different commodities. So we have a petroleum specification that's based on the Society of Petroleum Engineers system called PRMS, and the one that you're probably more familiar with, the Crisco solid mineral specifications. So you can see we're actually founded on these other specifications. And in fact, these are not the only two that link into the UNFC. You could have many other aligned systems, and as Charlotte mentioned, we're just about to publish the International Atomic Energy Agency's Red Book as another aligned system. We're working very closely now with the renewable energies world in developing a series of renewable energy estimates of reserves and resources. And we continue to have interest from people working in groundwater and a variety of other commodity types that we could put into the UNFC. Now, as I said, it's based on kind of three principles. And actually, if you look at different kind of classification systems throughout different industries, such as the electronics industry or aerospace, the best systems for classification of any commodity or any issue seem to follow this same three-tiered structure. And we did quite a bit of research on this as we were putting together the UNFC 2009. And it seems that following these three tiers of definition allow you to have much more clarity in applying the system and understanding how it works. So the first level is a set of definitions, and this is really the classification framework. So when people talk about what is the UNFC 2009 system, I would say most people are referring to these definitions. This is the classification framework. It's that cube of little cubes that you've all seen on the pictures. But that's just really the start of what the UNFC is. Sitting underneath that are a set of generic specifications and commodity-specific specifications that really give the rules about how you apply that framework to any individual commodity. So there are a set of specifications that are generic across all commodities, and then there's another set of specifications for each of the individual commodities, whether it be minerals, petroleum, or renewable energy. And then sitting beneath that is really, well, how do you actually use these rules now? How do I interpret those rules in general application? And these are the guidelines that sit underneath that, and these are really non-mandatory. They're just there as assistance. Some of the classification systems, and I'll use the SBPRMS petroleum system as an example here. In their document, they tend to muddle up these three. So there'll be places where they're having definitions, specifications, and guidelines, sometimes within the same paragraph. And that's okay, but it does become difficult for people sometimes to identify what's actually mandatory, what you actually have to do, versus what's a good idea to do in following the system. And that's where you can have confusion, I think, in the application. I mean, so just to simply put, if you think about that definition level, this is actually defining things. These are kind of, these are even more than mandatory. This is actually the law about how something is set up. Specifications are the mandatory rules that you have to apply in using the system. So if you want to apply it, you have to do this. And then guidelines are just good ideas, good practice, best practice about how to actually implement those in use. Now Charlotte said UNFC system is based around three criteria, and it's generally presented as a cube in this manner. But in reality, if you don't think in 3D, you're all geologists and mining engineers and people who work in the real world. So generally, this sort of environment, people do think pretty well in 3D, but a lot of people don't. You don't have to use it. Think about it this way. You can think of this as just there's three separate criteria upon which our reserves and resource estimates are measured. So three categories. We just use the E, F, and G as the letters as mnemonics for this. So the E category stands for the economic and social viability. So this is all concerns that go into the commerciality of a project. So it's not just financial issues, it's not just your NPV and your internal rate of return. These are issues around how you're going to affect the environment, how you're going to affect the social issues of communities around you, all the issues that go into a full view of commerciality of the project. The next axis, F, relates to the feasibility. So the field status and feasibility of that project. And this is a really key point here is the UNFC is not defining the reserves associated with the field or deposit. We're looking at individual projects. So we're classifying individual projects. So you need to define what that project is going to be that we're going to be ultimately recovering, the process that we're going to go through in reaching that recovery. Now, the UNFC also has space in it to put in the full geologic endowment of your deposit. So we will also capture those volumes that will not be recovered by any projects that you may have in place. But principally, we're looking at being a project-based system. By being, I mean, it's really fundamental, because not all systems are that way. The McKelvey box, for example, is not a project-based system. The McKelvey box is about taking the volumes that are in place, that deposit, and just subdividing them across the different boxes. The UNSC is about taking a project and what process we're going to need to put in place in that project to move it from wherever it sits in the UNSC system, move it through to production. So as I said yesterday, that is ultimately our goal in all of these processes. The final axis is geological knowledge. Now this axis actually operates slightly different from the other two axes. This is really an uncertainty or a certainty axis, if you want to think about it that way. It's where we measure how much we know about our deposit. And although it's using G as geology, there are other issues that come into uncertainty, just how well a project is going to function. So, you know, how well are you going to be able to capture these nodules? You know, you're going to put a number of different mechanisms in place and sleds and things to capture the nodules. How well are they actually going to work in that? What's their capture efficiency? Are they going to be 70% efficient? Are they going to be 50% efficient in actually capturing things? All of that would go into this category here under the geologic axis or uncertainty principle. So it's pretty easy to remember. EFG, economic and social viability, project feasibility, geologic certainty or knowledge associated with that. When we use the UNFC, we always report the values of these axes in order, E, F, and G. Each of the axes are subdivided into a number of categories. So the E axis, for example, has 3 categories. The F axis and G axis each have 4 major categories. So we always report our values that we're putting in the UNFC with a 3-digit a name effectively. So 111 would be meaning that you're sitting at level 1 on the E axis, level 1 on the F, and level 1 on the G axis. Each of the axes is set up so that there's levels of maturity as we move through them. And the highest level of maturity on each axis is number 1. The lowest is lower and our higher numbers. Okay. So 111 would mean you have the highest level of achievement on all 3 axes. Each of the axes, I said, have a set of definitions, and let's really quickly kind of just go through. I'm just going to put them up. I'm not going to read all of these to you here, but this is an example of what the 3 category definitions are for the E axis. So you can see E1 is extraction and sale has been confirmed to be economically viable, and again, we're using the phrase economic here to mean the full commerciality of the project. So that includes social and environmental issues as well. So it's fully viable and makes sense, basically. 2 is just saying it's expected to become economically viable in the foreseeable future. And we do give some assistance on interpreting what foreseeable means. Okay, so how far out is that in time? And then finally, 3 is it's not expected to become economically viable in the foreseeable future, or we're at too early stage to be making that determination. You know, I would say for many of the deposits we were discussing here, you're going to fit probably in E3. In some cases, it's possibly E2, and we certainly should be working to progress ourselves to where we understand that. I would say probably the largest concern that you're going to have in moving from E3 to E2 right now is going to be looking at social license issues. One of the major concerns is going to be looking at social and environmental issues in moving to that next stage there. Also mentioned that I mentioned yesterday that we are spending quite a bit of time right now looking at these sort of social license and environmental issues. We have a work group that's doing that right now, and one of the things they're looking at doing is taking the E2 category and subdividing that to describe in more detail the different categories and issues that we have around environmental and social license issues. The F-axis, or project feasibility axis, here is subdivided into 4 categories. And as you can see here, F1, is the highest level of project maturity, so something has been defined to be fully feasible. We understand how it works, and we can put it into place. F2, saying that we need to do some, is subject to further evaluation on this project. F3, at the moment, it can't be evaluated due to limited technical data. And F4 is that we haven't yet identified a project or operation to put it into place. So this is that category F4 where I said you could put the total endowment. So you're not throwing away volumes that were associated with your reservoir here. You can put every volume that's associated with that deposit is going to go somewhere in the queue. And this is what makes it unique from many other classification systems. And Crisco template, for example. Crisco template is about reporting volumes externally to the disclosure to a market, to investors. And it's only about talking about volumes that are associated with projects that you're planning on implementing. Whereas here we're allowing you to capture the full volume so you can really understand and describe the reserves and resources. And then finally, the G-axis, which I said is an uncertainty axis. And you can see G1, G2, G3 are associated basically with high, medium, and low confidence in understanding of those volumes, in description of those volumes. So you can think about this either as levels of uncertainty. Okay, so maybe you want to think about you have a 90% chance of reaching or exceeding that volume estimate. Do you have a 50% chance or a 10% chance of reaching or achieving those volume estimates? G4 are volumes that are associated particularly with deposits that are only being based on indirect evidence. So you think of these as kind of exploration volumes that you may not have actually penetrated. You don't have any actual measured or inferred data. It's all based on indirect information. So these are the 3 axes and the definitions associated with those. And these are the base category definitions that go into those. In actual fact, we have subcategories that sit beneath these that can also be used optionally to give additional detail and description of the reserves and resources associated with each of these categories. So you put it all together and you wind up with the UNFC cube, which you've all seen. And we'll perhaps just as an example, work through one particular category within the system. So if we're perhaps on the E1 axis, I'll have a project and I've evaluated it and I've determined that it is fully economic viable, meets all the requirements I need to put this project into place. So it would meet that definition there. The F1 category, it's a project that is fully feasible. I can go ahead and put it in place and I know how to do this project. It makes sense. And finally the G1, it's at level G1 on the G-axis, and here means I have a high confidence that I understand those volumes associated. And if you read those 3 categories together, if you read those 3 definitions, I think you'll see that that sounds an awful lot like the Crisco definition of proved reserves. And that's exactly what it is. So it's UNFC class 111, and that would map to the proved reserve classification in pretty much any resource system. So this is how we put together the 3 different categories to come up with that one system. By being able to break any category into these constituent parts on the 3 axes, economic, project feasibility, and geologic uncertainty, we're able to get a lot more granularity and information about the barriers to progressing the volumes. And that's really the key to applying the UNFC and the power that it has. However, once you've mapped that system into these different categories, you can start doing interesting things with them, to start cutting and slicing and looking at effectively different rows or planes of the system in the UNFC system. And you can flatten the cube if you choose to. And this is the way we suggest you flatten it within the UNFC 2009 document. However, there are other optional ways that you can choose to do this as well. So you can see I've taken different category combinations of the E, F, and G, and I've called those different given them different class names. So commercial projects are those that meet the E and F axis. They're at the highest level, so they're things that are fully economically viable, and I understand the project with them, so they're highlighted here in green. Commercial projects, and if you were to look back on the cube, you can see that's that upper row of cells there. Those are volumes that meet that definition of a commercial projects. And under conventional systems, those would be called reserves. Okay, so those are basically reserves, proved probable possible reserves under CRISCO or PRMS or most other classification systems. We further subdivide things into potentially commercial projects, non-commercial projects, exploration projects, and we also, which is unique I think in the UNFC, is we capture these additional quantities of volumes in place. So we are looking at the whole endowment within in the deposit. Now, by flattening the system, we then can do the unique thing of taking these different categories or project maturity thresholds, and we can map it directly to CRISCO. Okay? And this is where the mapping or bridging between the documents comes into place. And we can map things to mineral reserves, mineral resources, and we can do the subdivisions as well within there, and as exploration results under the new CRISCO template, which does define these results. Now you see there are a lot of places there, however, though, non-commercial projects and these additional quantities and places that aren't actually captured within the CRISCO system. And this is why we think you should be using, or should be looking at the power of the UNFC in addition to simply doing your external disclosure. The UNFC allows you to look at your total resource space and allows you to come up with mechanisms to progress those volumes through the different categories. If you use the UNFC, and you do categorize the UNFC into its constituent categories, it's very straightforward to produce the estimates that would be required by CRISCO for disclosure. So if you're using the UNFC, it's a trivial step to move to reporting under CRISCO. The volumes have all been estimated under the guidelines that would be required for CRISCO disclosure. It's just a matter of how you choose to present those to the market. There really is no technical work required at all. It's just a matter of taking the individual map categories that you need that represent the different CRISCO categories and choosing those out. And similarly, we have the same sort of mapping for the SPE-PRMS here. So that the real value of this alignment between the systems, I said, is you can make the estimates using CRISCO standards, and then you can simply report those under whichever system you choose to use. So I could report volumes under the UNFC categories, or I can report them under the CRISCO categories if I choose to do that. But the same quantities are being reported under either of the two systems. It's absolutely independent of commodity type as well, which gives you quite a bit of power. And I missed a slide here. I'll go back to this one here. Let me jump to this one here. One of the interesting things that I think is basically the different colored boxes on here, the rows here, are effectively the CRISCO categories, and they're presented in that way. But there are other cells on here you can see that aren't colored in that I think have quite a bit of interest in application of the UNFC. And to me, what's I think the most interesting category up here are things that fall into the F1, E2 area. So these cells in here, this kind of white row behind there. If you think about what that means, E2 means there are volumes that I have an economic barrier to progressing them. Okay, they're not fully viable. There's an economic barrier. F1, however, means it's a project that is fully feasible. I understand that project. I know how to implement it. It means the only reason this can't be called a reserve is that I have some sort of a commercial barrier that needs to be overcome. And that's something that we often forget. As you know, most of us in the room are technical people. We want to look at everything as a technical issue. But actually, oftentimes, progression of volumes is not a technical issue. It's a commercial, legal, social issue. That set of blocks highlights that this is an issue that I can take forward and move forward from a technical point of view. It's only being delayed because of other, the softer commercial issues, which often these days are not soft at all. They're actually the hardest ones to move forward. And I think that's a very important set of criteria for this group, particularly to be thinking about what are the social issues to move it forward, what are the economic issues to move it forward, what are the environmental issues to move us forward. If it's just a commercial barrier, I mean, if it truly is just a financial issue in moving those forward, that's an interesting subset of volumes to know, to have discussions with your state. Okay, so what could governments do potentially to incentivize you to progress those forward? Could they give you tax breaks on that? Could they give you some sort of some sort of assistance to move those forward? And that you do see that sort of behavior in many circumstances where a nation wants to progress volumes within a certain region. So it's interesting to have those sorts of discussions and to use the granularity of the UNFC system. I think will highlight those issues much clearer than using a system like Crisco for your management of volumes. Crisco is the right choice to use for disclosure of volumes, but the UNFC will allow you to manage those volumes better. So specifications, I talked about the three levels there: definitions, specifications, and guidelines. So that was the definitions we went through. We break in and look more detail at the specifications or application rules. The UNFC is set up around a system of generic specifications, which all commodities need to meet. So these are kind of the basics that we would expect everybody to be able to fulfill. The way we have these in the UNFC is we're very clear in our specifications about which things are absolutely mandatory. So whenever you see the word shall in the UNFC, that means this is something you absolutely have to do. Should is something that we highly recommend you. It's preferred. You don't have to do it, but it's definitely what we suggest you do. And may is used when it's something that is just one of the many alternatives that can be used. But again, it may be best practice to follow this one route. We do set a number of generic specifications as the minimum standard for reporting, and we expect that all commodity systems would have similar type of requirements. So a basic one would be effective date. So if you're going to report volumes, you need to tell me what's the date at which you made this estimate. And that's, of course, particularly important when you take in commercial issues such as price, because price will obviously impact your classification. It won't necessarily impact the total volume, but it may impact which classification those volumes go into. Another thing that would be important, of course, on date is how much you've already produced. So reserves and resources are remaining quantities. So if I need to know how much I produced by a certain date, we include that. So effective date is one of our generic specifications that's particularly important. Another one is reference points. Where's the point where you're actually making this estimate of reserves? It will change at different stages of processing through your system. Of course, there'll be losses associated with each stage. So knowing where I am in that stage, what's the reference point that I'm making that measurement? So in total, we actually have 20 different generic specifications. It sounds like a lot, but actually when you read through them, I think you would see that each of them are actually quite obvious. So they cover a number of different issues, as you can see here, from disclosure issues to defining the levels of project maturity as you move through, issues adding additional clarity around different categories, how you aggregate volumes, can you aggregate different commodities. I think this is a real issue for you in nodule because you've got many, many different commodities contained within one deposit, and how you present that is an important issue. See what was there. So actually one specification I think might be particularly of interest to you, and following discussions that we had yesterday, is around the classification of additional quantities in place. So in some situations, you're going to want to actually classify those volumes that are additionally in place and what are the issues associated with them. So as I said, you can have subcategories, and the F4 category is around these volumes that are additional in place, but we have suggested 3 subcategories underneath that, as you can see here. So the F1 is saying that the technology to recover these quantities under active development. So I would think that probably could fit in with what you're doing here. Or F2 is the technology to recover is currently being researched, but we haven't yet done any successful pilot studies. I would argue that you don't fall in that category because I think you do have some clear pilot studies in many cases. And finally, F3, technology is not under development, so it's something you just don't know how to do, how to recover that. And that, well, where things might fit in the F2 or F3 for you might be some of the stuff that you're leaving behind as you go over this, because there are volumes that are being left behind there. How do you go through and make sure that you're sweeping up every last piece there? So I think this is kind of a level of detail that you can go into with UNFC to try and capture and quantify all the volumes you have. Now we do have officially said we do base the UNFC on a base system to provide all the commodities. The UNF, we're at the expert group, which is the UNFC. Although we're all experts in our own commodities, our goal is not to reproduce or create a new classification system. We wanted to have the UNSC rely on existing systems as much as possible. And we do this through what we call bridging documents. So these are systems that have been aligned to inform the basic commodity-specific specifications for each of the commodity types. So for minerals, we're using the Crisco system. For uranium, in particular, we're using the IAEA system. And again, even those two systems within the UNSC, because of course you could classify uranium using the Crisco system. We need to make sure that they're aligned, so whichever system you chose to use, you'd end up in the same place. So we have a bridging document. These, I said, are aligned systems. Solid minerals, we're using Crisco. Petroleum, we're using the SPE system. Uranium, the Red Book, and as I said, we're looking at other systems now for renewables. We're looking at perhaps taking the Russian classification system for both minerals and petroleum and bridging that into the UNFC. And we started to have some discussions with China to see if we could perhaps take the Chinese system for reserves estimation and map that into the UNFC as well. So here's an example of how we bridge between the systems. It's a bit complicated to plot at first here, but let me walk through it. The two axes that are presented here are the E-axis and the F-axis, so the economic and sociability criteria and the project feasibility criteria. So effectively, I'm looking at one plane through the system. And the plane that's coming out of the page is the G-axis, which is the geologic uncertainty. And the reason I've chosen not to show that axis is because I think you all understand uncertainty pretty well. You understand that there can be high, medium, low estimates of uncertainty. I think that's actually the easiest stuff for us to capture. It's probably the most important category to understand. Okay. Sometimes a pure geologist sometimes gets mad at me that I've taken the plane this direction because they think the most important one is that geologic uncertainty. And I'm absolutely saying it's the most important. I'm saying I think we all understand that. So I'm looking at these, so what I'm effectively looking at here is really the kind of macro commerciality of the project, looking at the economics of it and the feasibility of it. So I've sliced it through that way. These are each of the categories and subcategories of the different projects. And how they're colored here, and the numbers just refer to the color. So the dark green is always number one. It's just, so you can print this in black and white and see it as well. So and also there are people who have difficulty seeing colors, of course. So the numbers and colors match. But you can see the colors are associated with the project maturity of the Crisco system. So mineral reserves are broken up into levels 1, 2, and 3, depending on whether they're on production, approved for development, or justified for development. And you can see where those would map to within the UNFC system. So we have a direct one-to-one mapping between what goes into each of the categories in the Crisco bridging system, in the UNFC system, will map directly into one of the categories within the Crisco system. And this is why I'm saying that reporting is really quite easy for this. If I've mapped everything into the UNFC, I simply have to go into this table to see how I would just translate those volumes into the Crisco system directly. There's really no additional work required. I can write a little program to do it if I've got everything into an Excel spreadsheet. Very trivial to do that. So I'm getting the power of understanding my reservoirs, my deposits, and I've got the power to go ahead and report them however I choose to do that. Okay? And as I was saying earlier, as an example, I was giving that E1, that E2 F1 category. You can see is this number 4 here. You can see that you can see number 4 appears in quite a few different places here. So mineral resources, development pending mineral resources, which are probably like inferred or indicated resources under the Crisco template. They can be at that stage of maturity for a number of different reasons. It could be at that stage for technical issues or commercial issues. Just looking at the number, I can't tell what the reason is. Using the UNFC gives me a little more insight into those numbers to be able to identify that. Now the subcategories we're showing here are the standard subcategories that are used by the UN system, and they're consistent and the same for each of the commodity types. But we do say in the document that the subcategories are optional, and you actually have the right to develop your own subcategorizations. So it might be something for the ISA to consider if you're going to request people to use the UNFC system. Maybe you want to align a set of subcategories that's specific for issues associated with deep sea mining. I'm not a domain expert, so I can't give you any assistance on that. But it might be something to consider, and would be happy to work with you and get some people who are domain experts into to think about maybe there's a slightly different categorization system that would provide more insight to you. But really what the system is about providing that information and assistance and progression. And if there's a better way to do it than what we have here, that's what we want you to use. And I said it is a process. It's about understanding the deposit, developing that project, and then testing the social and economic aspects. And in fact, that's the way you do every project that you develop. We do this all the time. Any engineer, geoscientist, given a new deposit to look at, these are the 3 steps they follow. I think you can see those 3 steps map directly into the UNFC. It's a logical system. It's a very logical system. It's the way we go through our analyses every day anyways. This is just a way of capturing those volumes that are actually fully consistent with this and providing that extra information. Okay. I mentioned earlier, I'm going to kind of slightly change tack here and focus a little bit on the commercial issues, that environmental aspects, the E-axis on the E-axis. I mentioned earlier that the goal of stakeholders is quite varied. So we've got businesses, they've got one set of reasons for looking at reserves and resources. Governments have other issues, and all the other stakeholder groups that go into these, whether they be investors, whether they be NGOs, whether they be the financial community. And oftentimes we say, well, every stakeholder's goals are different, hence you can't really come up with a classification system that works. I'm going to actually propose that there is a little bit of, there's one kind of principle and goal that all the stakeholder groups do have in common, however, and that's the issue of sustainability. Because even businesses, I'll tell you, actually, businesses, this is like a dirty secret, I think, is that businesses' goal really isn't to make money. A business's goal is actually to be sustainable. They want to be around next year so they can not only pay the dividend this year, I want to be around so I can pay my dividends next year. Okay, we really, obviously, if you're not making money, you're going to have some issues with your board of directors. On the longer term, really, the goal of the business is to have sustainability. And I think a lot of other cultures than Western cultures have understood this for a long time, and I think we're starting to actually embrace that a bit more. We really want to have that longevity. That's why companies, when they have, well, actually I saw in the paper today, it's Chevron's 135th anniversary this year, and companies celebrate when they have big momentous events, that they've been along for a long time. Sustainability is key. Sustainability is obviously key for governments. They want to make sure that they've got resources to provide for their people for a long time. And stakeholder groups, communities, individuals, investors, everybody's looking to be able to have this return on investments or sustainability of the environment around them in which they're working. And I think we should really be capturing that one issue, that one place where everybody is converging on their goals, and using that as a powerful way to move forward the world there. So one way of looking at this is the concept of corporate responsibility and the triple bottom line. Triple bottom line was proposed by John Elkington in the California Business Review in 1994, and subsequently he wrote a book called Cannibals with Forks. And the principle behind that was it's going to take more than corporate responsibilities. Okay, and a business can't just say, well, I'm going to be responsible from now. And the metaphor he used for that was that it's like a cannibal. If you give a cannibal a fork, it doesn't make him immediately more sophisticated and modern. You know, you have to change something more fundamental in the nature there. It's not just about corporate responsibility. You actually have to change the way companies look at the way it does its work. And by looking at it in a new light, a new paradigm, you know, you can really start to get improved performance and optimize the enterprise. And he suggested that you need to look at three things here. So I've gone from a cube to a triangle now. The three axes that he's proposing is the financial, social, and environmental issues. And these are really the three, what he calls the triple bottom line. Is you can't just look at the financial issues. You've got to look at all three, and you have to look at all three all the time to make sure that you've got them in balance. So you can't just say, this is a technical issue, I'm not going to bother about anything else, I'm just going to solve this, because you'll be spending so much time on that, you'll be ignoring these other issues that are just as important in reaching the solution and taking things forward in a positive way. You must look at all three in balance at all times, working through. And kind of at the same time, there's some proposals about how to look at sustainable development. And these are related around comprehensive extraction, where you get everything at once, don't leave anything behind, disturb things only once. The social license to operate, working with communities, and the principle of environmentalism, leaving zero waste, making sure that you're not actually creating damage in what you're doing as well. And I think you see these line up exactly with those three principles of the triple bottom line. And I'd even go further; they line up pretty closely with the three axes of the UNFC. So all these different ideas that people are having around how to develop things in a modern, socially, environmentally sensitive way, all actually are doing the same thing. They're just different lenses through which we can look at these different principles. And it's really important to understand that if you, as I said, if you try and go too far on one route without looking at the other concerns of the other points on the triangle, you will not have the most optimum development strategy. You just need to keep them balanced. And it is an issue to keep balanced. There's not a right or wrong answer on this. On Sunday, when I get on the plane, I picked up my Independent. I opened it up. On page 4, there was an article about a group that is trying to make ecocide a criminal, an international criminal charge that could actually be tried by the International Criminal Court. So ecocide would be, on the same level as genocide, and can be tried internationally. So there's one group doing that, and then I flipped over the page, and the next page there was an article by an MP in the UK saying that we need to throw out all of our environmental policies in the UK, or else we're not going to meet our energy needs going forward. So you kind of got two opposite things on two different pages in the paper. Which one is right? Well, both of them are right, and neither of them are right. Okay, there's a balance between them. If all you're doing is focus on environmental issues, you're not going to have development. If all you're focusing on is development issues, you're not going to have a sustainable environment. So you have to be balancing these all at the same time. So the exciting thing, I think, is taking taking the principles of this triple bottom line and how you suddenly start to see what your key performance indicators are. Companies like KPIs. And typically we look at things like net present value and return on investment. But hey, there's a lot more now under this new world. We can start to look at building long-term partnerships with our communities. How are we going to be able to do that and incentivize communities to work with us that it's not a matter of having competing issues with groups. We want to actually work together to find out what's the best way to solve things. And maybe we find that maybe doing a project in a certain area just isn't the right thing to do. And I feel rather strongly like that. We only have to look at the issue around shale gas production in the States to see if that happens. Very little opposition to shale gas development in places like Wyoming. Very little there. Huge in upstate New York. Well, maybe you need to balance those issues and have discussions with partnership. We'd be working in a partnership to be able to make those sorts of developments. So you see lots of different ways we can look at how we actually measure success to a company. At the end of the day, it is going to be about the financials to the business because we have to pay our shareholders. But being able to do that in a sustainable way might mean taking a slightly lower NPV or rate of return to be able to meet these other requirements and to have that sustainability. Principle of comprehensive extraction, I think I'm giving time here. Okay. The issues around comprehensive extraction, I think, are pretty interesting on this issue for you particularly, because you are producing multiple minerals at the same time here. The concept came out of some work in the 90s in Russia and China, initially focused on uranium resources as a byproduct of phosphate production. But they really are generally applicable. And in fact, in the oil industry, we've done it for a long time. We frequently produce oil and gas. We always produce oil and gas out of our reservoirs, but oftentimes we'll produce things like helium. We may sell CO2 as a byproduct. We are looking at doing that type of comprehensive extraction. Don't always do a great job on that, but it's something that also I think it's got a lot of potential, obviously, within the mining industry as well. So it's not just these primary resources, but also secondary resources. We've got an awful lot of mine tailings around the world that have huge resource potential for a variety of commodities and then other issues around slags and things like that, where there are potential for further development. And it gives us a chance, I think, to really rethink both the balance sheet, so what's the value of our deposits, and also the flow sheet, or the process about which we're going to go through developing. So how are we actually going to put projects in place to optimize development? And the methodology around comprehensive extraction really needs to be the whole life cycle. So you need to think about addressing all available resources from the very start. If you go into looking at developing a project and think, I'm only going in here to develop the phosphate associated with this. I'm here to produce, I'm trying to produce some sort of an agricultural commodity. I'm going to develop the phosphates in here so I can make fertilizer. If I just go in with that mindset and don't think about all the other things that are there, I might lose or develop the field, the deposits in a way that's not optimum to develop all of the resources at once. So having this idea of not thinking of things as simply as primary and secondary resources, but thinking of it as a single deposit with many potentials, the complex resource base that I'm going to put together and move through, so I have zero waste, only disturb the ground once effectively. So minimize the impact both for the environment, for communities, and actually for ourselves as well as on a business point of view, because I'm only having to go in and do things once there. And this does actually require some thought about the resource assessment, because I need to not only know what my base resources are, but I also need to think about all these auxiliary resources, the secondary resources that might be associated with it, and make those estimates. Some of them are going to be more economic at a given point in time than another. So coming up with the total project-based resources becomes actually quite complicated. And I would argue that something as simple as the McKelvey box, for example, doesn't meet the needs of this sort of situation. However, as you probably guessed, I'm going to say the UNFC, does meet this because of this 3D framework around the E, F, and G axes. it does allow us to take multiple commodities and to classify on a project basis through these different axes. So a given project, a single project, can have different commodities in different levels of commercial maturity associated with them. And by having this international cooperation across these diverse stakeholder groups, as I said, I think the UNFC is really uniquely placed to deal with these issues around comprehensive extraction. Just a couple of really little quick examples. The guys working on comprehensive extraction around the world, they like to use technology metaphors for these types of projects. So they use the same terminology that we use for mobile phones. They like to think of this as what they call a 3G, so third generation example of combining uranium and phosphate production within a single flow sheet. So it's an example from Brazil. So you can see they're doing, basically they're trying to produce fertilizer at the end of the day out of this system. So it's been very easy to go from phosphate mining straight into the fertilizer. But they're able to to change the flow sheet so that they're actually at the same time coming up with the uranium and the concentrated ore by modifying the process. So this is kind of what they're calling a third generation example, which they're taking the ideas of comprehensive extraction and working out a way to use everything that's in that reservoir system. But in reality, the real goal they have is what they call 4G. So fourth generation extraction is really look at the whole basin and not just using the output from one single mine, but look at how can I go into a basin and identify what's the oil, gas, all the minerals that are there, and actually develop the entire basin in one fell path. So it's an integrated management extraction process that's disturbing the ground once and getting all of the resource potential out in one pass. Okay, so I'm going to stop here actually. So kind of in summary here, key points up here. I've said them ad nauseum, so I'm not going to go into detail, but really. The UNFC system, I think, is a generic principles-based system which allows you some modification and specialization to make it more specific to your needs. And I think that's a key point here to get, is that the UNFC is flexible enough to meet the needs that you have if you want to take the time to do that. So I'm not pushing any system on you, but we're happy to work with you to make it as useful for you as we possibly can on this. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of the linkage that we have to Frisco. I said we'd never talk about the UNFC without talking about Frisco, because it is the basis of the system. We actually call it in the document, I think we call it the keystone and foundation of the system. So we're very key that Frisco is the basis of the UNFC system. It's kind of like a value-added version of Frisco. Gives you a little more insight into the numbers. But you do have the ability to go ahead and report under that system as clearly as you can. And really, it's about communication, as I said. So it gives you a clear way to go ahead and communicate the value of your volumes going forward. And a couple of maybe observations here. Okay. There. So the UNFC, it's as I said, it's suitable for application to seabed mineral resources. There's no question you can use it for that. And I think that having that E and F access and the ability to subdivide the F4, which was your additional quantities in place, I think is really important to you going forward. So I think there's definitely some value here to you. Worth having a good look at this. Warm, fuzzy comment at the end here is that, we really can have sustainable energy for all, sustainable mining for all, in fact, by use of something like the UNFC. And I'm really looking forward to some further discussions this week on some of the advantages that we can possibly give you. So I'm going to stop here. There is more in this little bit of sales pitch here. You're going to get copies of these slides so you can get all of these different web addresses through here. We do have a meeting planned, the 6th session of the EGRC expert group in Geneva last week of April, first week of May there. We'll be holding that in Geneva, and we will be holding a workshop on kind of the details, a one-day workshop on how you apply the UNFC on the 28th of April. And I'm just going to propose, as an option, is we frequently have back-to-back meetings with stakeholder groups of one sort or another. So the IAEA frequently meets at the UN right before or right after, sometimes during our EGRC meeting. And so we kind of link together. That way people only have to travel once. Certainly be, I think I'm speaking for Charlotte here, saying she would like to welcome the ISA if you'd like to consider having a meeting, in Geneva at that same time, that we could work together to there'll certainly be larger stakeholder groups from each group there. And then finally, on the issue around comprehensive extraction, I've put these contact names of Harry Tacitus from the IAEA, Roberto Villas-Boas, and Julian Hilton, who've all done quite a bit of work on comprehensive extraction. And if you have any questions for them, I'm sure they'd be happy to discuss it more detail. So I'm going to finally stop there, and Charlotte and I would be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thanks, Dave, for the presentation. What about 15 minutes right now? Take questions, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, David and Charles, thank you very much for that. That was, I think that was excellent. Can I just comment that the issue the ISA faces, it's got parallels with national reporting, even though it's not a nation as such, it's a jurisdiction. And what you're suggesting, this idea of aligning specific categories, it's possibly something that could provide a great benefit to the ISA and to contractors, because basically, if you know what the rules are, if you know exactly what you're going to need to do, then there's a limited amount of additional technical input that's required. So I'd just be wanting to sort of voice my support for considering basically getting together to confirm if there's a need for some sort of alignment of special categories, and sort of getting over any hurdles that might come in the way of implementing this system, so that the ISA not only has reports that come in that give information from each of the areas in question, but that can all then readily be joined together to give a jurisdictional report and give us a clearer picture of how much resource, how much commodity there is available. So, thank you.
Dr. Das was
Thank you for very interesting. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. It was very started with a very simple thing, and I will go on interesting, very complicated and very interesting also. I go by the first block. Can you show me the first block? You have shown the first block. I want to see it.
Which one?
the first slide.
Three axis.
Oh, three axis, okay.
With this hero, and I'm just reminding you from this my friends, with this hero, if you go to the next slide, you will see how it works. The axis is economic and social environment.
Yes.
And when you have shown that you will see how it works, the social factor has not been reflected there. state with the oil and gas resources and energy resources, where all the technologies are in place. What we were debating yesterday, and if we go after this, that 841, 842, 843, because there we are talking about technology, where we are studying yesterday how to link it, because without technology and without the resources is there, and the economic analysis is there, but in between there is a linkage about the technology aspect. There technology is yet to be matured, and it cannot be correct directly to compare with the resources what has been done already by IFSCO, and UN system is also participating in that, and how to bridge that gap, because unless that part is rich enough and correct enough, and the technology aspect, how you are planning to build up in this model to make it a complete system.
Well, that's a lot of good questions. Thank you very much. So if you look at this slide here, which I'm glad we talked about, is economic here. We're using economic here in a kind of a macro, that doesn't sound right, but in a more holistic way to define the word economic. Economic doesn't mean financial. It doesn't just mean financial issues. Something can't be economic unless it contains all the issues that are required to progress something forward. So it does implicitly include issues around social and environmental issues. And while it's not on this slide here, if you go into the UNFC documents, which we have a few copies here if you'd like to pick up here, if you go into that document, yeah, it does, there is a footnote. It is unfortunately just in a footnote, but it does clearly state that economic includes social and environmental issues as well. And as I did mention, we have I think if I had to rewrite the UNFC 2009 over, if there was going to be a 2014 version, which there's not, we would make it much more explicit that this is actually covering all of these other issues. We do have a work program in place right now, as I said, to expand the guidance and specifications around the E-axis. And they will be providing us with quite a bit of additional information on guidelines and how to actually apply it. And my suspicion, I don't know for sure, my suspicion is that they're going to suggest that we break the E2 category up into a number of subcategories to be more explicit on what the barriers are to progressing it. Because understanding if something's an environmental issue or a community-based issue, I think is going to be quite important in moving things forward. Your second question, okay, do you want to comment on that?
Very clear, we have adjusted, we have so, but when the reference point, date.
Would be what? Sorry.
Reference date. That takes care of your restructuring economy of the because today is the economy, tomorrow is the economy, so that you are taking care of by taking the date. But I am not yet convinced how you are going to fill the gap of the
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so that second question there is on technology. I mean, we do have the project feasibility axis, which is the next one here, that subdivides the issues, subdivides the category looking at maturity of the project moving forward. Now, this is an area where I do think some specification and guidance from the ISA, specifically on deep water minerals, would be of value, because what you really want to have here is consistent application between the contractor groups, for example, on how they're making their estimates of what is the maturity of different project types. So this is where some additional guidance that could be written by this group here would be of value. And the UNFC, the GRC, we'd be happy to provide you with some technical assistance on producing that. But you, as kind of the commodity or technique, stewards, really are the ones that should be taking responsibility for that. But the general framework of UNFC is here and allows you to do that. I would argue that most other classification systems that you could look at don't have that flexibility. So you're basically in a situation where you can either choose to put something together that's completely bespoke just for yourselves, which is okay, you want to do that, but you then lose the comparability and the kind of international acceptance that you have by using this framework, and then the specification and kind of specification of it underneath this framework.
Yeah.
I think these are very important presentations for us to understand the mineral resource and reserve classification. This system tried to use the umbrella to cover all of the state systems or local systems. I think this is the requirement of the globalization of petroleum and the mining industry. So this is the direction and the trend. We can using this system, we can have the same ruler to measure the mineral resource and reserve categories or classes. I know that there are some mapping efforts made. For instance, Crisco did some mapping into the UNFC system. We know there are two, in this workshop, we have two systems, UNFC 2009 and the Crisco system. Crisco, UNFC has the advantage of the well-defined categories and the specifications. Crisco has the advantage of easy to use and widespread. So when develop a state system, people want to take advantage of these both systems. How to do that? I read some mapping, but still confused. For instance, Crisco use the terms categories, okay, 6 categories, and for UNFC use classes. So categories versus classes, 2 terms. These 2 terms should be mapped, So far the mapping only on the level, on the middle level, the class level or category level. I think that we should do some, UNFC should give us some guidelines to do the mapping on bottom level, on category level, on axis level, you have a very nice, the UNFC has very well defined the access level, G1, G2, F1, F2, E1, E2, okay? Very nice. The main categories and the subcategories. Crisco use a combination of terms to describe the G1, G2, E1, E2, use the continuity for geology, use confidence for geology and feasibility study, use variability for economic variance. So I think, in fact, both UNFC and Crisco has 3 axes. UNFC has geology, feasibility study, and economy, okay, 3 axes. Crisco also has 3 axes, geology, modification, and economy, okay? So if we do some bottom mapping, we can get more clear concept of each category, the meaning of each category. Then the classes or the classes based on the category. So this mapping should be more
precise than the mapping law. So that's my, I no question, just make some recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess there's one comment on that is kind of the issues around terminology when we're referring to classes or categories. The problem we have in developing UNFC 2009 is that the SPE system for petroleum wasn't consistent in its use of classes and categories with the Crisco system. So we're never going to have them be exactly the same. What we're looking to have is, as you said, is mapping and a way to move from one system to another between this, and avoid issues around terminology as much as possible, which is why we've gone to a numerical-based system specifically here. We have, of course, we have the bridging document, as I know you're very aware of, that I presented in one of the last slides there. It is showing it on a axis-by-axis basis, the mapping. I do agree with you that more work could be spent in guidance on how to actually make the application, and particularly case examples is what we really need right now.
And one thing, just you use quantity, okay? You never use resource and reserve.
Yeah.
Just use quantity. Yeah. Critical use resource and reserve. So I understand why you use quantity, because you want to extend this system into some other field, for instance, chemical or some other resources.
Yes.
So quantity is okay,
Yeah.
but for mining, no ore, no mineral, the people would not get used, would be confused. So I think that this is the umbrella for all of the natural resources. But for geology and mining, I think it's better to add some mineral,
I mean, that's when you notice when I was speaking, I wasn't using the word quantity. I was, I tried to use relevant terms as we're going through. It is difficult because I'm a petroleum person. I always call things fields, whereas you call them deposits. So I try to correct that when I get through that. But this actually, the renewable energy people don't like these terms either, because a solar resource doesn't really make sense to call that a deposit. So it's everybody is basically nobody's happy. So you've got a good compromise when everybody's unhappy. So.
I think you made an excellent case for a large, comprehensive classification system. Our immediate issue, though, is we have a secretariat that is managing a system that is required to be cost-effective, and a assembly and console that bring that to being by giving the secretariat less money than they think they need to do their job. So initially, this has to be very focused on what the secretariat takes on. So I very much appreciate your emphasis on the mapping the Crisco standard to this larger. I think in the long term, as the Secretariat has to address more than 3 types of minerals, and has to bring that into coordination with national planning, that this system can be a great tool. In the short term, as in the next 5 years, it's really going to have to narrow its focus so that the contractors can focus on a couple specific items, and the Secretariat can get its minimum requirement, which is, to use the current terminology, proved, probable, and possible reserves. So I think that really maps to what is currently out of the Crisco standard. So I'd like to be sure that you feel that if work is done now on getting reports in the Crisco standards, that those form a core around which at a later time this could be expanded when the authority has the resources to do so. That the systems are compatible, but it can be taken on as a step-by-step, getting broader and more integrated as it goes along.
You certainly could do that. I would, as again, I'm not trying to push anything, but I would maybe propose a slight alternative solution to that would be, say I'm going to adopt the UNFC system. However, I'm only going to have required disclosure of certain categories within this, and then choose the categories that map directly to the Crisco system. So you're actually reporting the exact, you're actually asking for the same information, but you're asking it with the UNFC terminology. You can actually, I would actually write it out in such a way, the presentation of the requirement would be that these are the categories that are consistent with Crisco disclosure, so you're being very clear about that. Why I would suggest you do it that way is that you could then quite clearly write the guidance that goes along with the UNFC categories. It might be easier to expand that in the future to then say, well, actually, internally within the contractor groups, you might also want to be looking at these other categories for your own management system. Because as I said before, a good system, if I'm a contractor group, I would actually want to be using the whole UNFC because I would think it would give me more insight into